Okay, so as I said, welcome to episode 50 of Words on Whiskey, quite a milestone for us. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we're delighted to be streaming this live also to the fabulous event that's been happening online through Belfast Whiskey Week. So for all those listening on that platform, you're all very welcome, and hopefully we'll see you again on our platform before long. And to celebrate the occasion, I've got two good friends that have been very good to the show and been very good to the magazine, and we'll talk about what they're going to offer. So look, thank you for supporting us through the last 50 episodes. We're looking forward to the next 50, touch wood, all going well. We know it's been a difficult time for everybody, and so hopefully this has brought some level of entertainment and information to you over that period. Of course, it is brought to you by Irish Whiskey Magazine, and if you can support the magazine, we'd really appreciate that, or if you even can follow us on YouTube and subscribe to our channel, that would be fantastic. So look, let's get on with it. We've, as I said, we've had the pleasure in the magazine of hosting, for me, one of the most interesting series in the magazine, which is the 7 Sips series. And that 7 Sips series is very much the brainchild of our next guest, Fionnán O'Connor, whose research into historic Mashbills, the history of Irish whiskey, is really second to none, and really respect what he has done for the industry. And, you know, some of you may have had a taste of what that is. So look, let's get straight into it and bring in Fionnán. And we're also going to bring in someone who has collaborated with Fionnán in bringing 3 interesting samples now to discuss that are relevant in historic Mashbills. So David from Rademon Estate Distillery. So let's bring them both in. Fionnán, David, good evening.
Good evening. Curveball, you know, minute 5.
Warming up. David, have you any voices there on you? You probably got spirit, I'm sure you have.
After dinner time.
Yeah. Look, you're very welcome, and thank you both very much for agreeing to come on. I'm really excited about what is coming up, and from 2 perspectives, for the work that Fionnán has done in terms of researching the historic Mashbills and coming up with, you know, a whole sensory exploration and research around that. I think that's fantastic for the industry and Irish whiskey as a whole. And David, what you're doing now over in Rademon, I've been up there. It's a fantastic distillery set on a beautiful estate, and what you've done has been really fantastic. I've tried some of the new makes, and I know you did something on Sunday. So who's going to kick it off? Who will kick it off? We'll kick it off with Fionnán, and for a start, talk about maybe how this brainchild came about for 7 Sips.
Yeah, so I know this one's been a long ways in the works. You know, we used to do these in pubs. As you can see, I'm still in a pub.
You never left.
But we were doing them pub by pub, sip by sip, going through the history from Aquavita, Osquabao, etc., up to where we are now, which is industrial grain whiskey, urban Belfast, height of Belfast industrial prowess in its least sung about industry, which, you know, it was and I never thought we'd be able to do this one, because who the hell has a small column still? You know, it was one thing to faff about with farmyard whiskey and all the fun things we've done, but the idea that someone would be able to make grain whiskey as it was unheard of, and there wasn't the same, you know, sex appeal that there was with you know, pot still or putching or any of this stuff, you know. And then I was talking to David, and I believe David has a connection to the area around Connswater, and, you know, we got into a conversation about what was left of the distillery, the space, that history, and this is the brainchild of that conversation as much as anything, you know. And I've mostly spoken to David in the past about his pot still, but, you know, so this was a really offbeat project. But yeah, it was, you know, and a part of the thesis that doesn't get a lot of the look in has been about the history of Irish column still distilling, because it's still a mash bill, you know, and the fact that stuff is so odd has gone really. If the pot still stuff was lost, the column still stuff was outright forgotten, you know, and nobody mourned its passing. And it was only when David said, right, well, you know, even though it's a lighter distillate, so we started doing, I think, well, I won't give the game away of what we've done, but talking about the potential of the Irish grain category today and how people could muck about with that in a way that I don't think has even been, you know, discussed, let alone distilled.
Yeah, it's always kind of been the weaker sibling of pot still and single malt grain whiskey. And I suppose let's start off first, Fionnán, and distinguish the definition of grain whiskey, because it is different in Scotland to what it is in Ireland, sadly.
And what we've tried to do with, and as you know, what we've tried to do with the magazine series is discuss these items. So for those who haven't had the previous sips, the idea is to look at something from the past and see what we can draw from it in a contemporary setting and get an innovative producer to muck about with it and then have a hoolie in a pub. And the whole thing got halted by COVID because you can't have hoolies in pubs. So we're doing it through Belfast Whiskey Week, which, again, no better setting because Belfast was far and away the capital of grain whiskey distilling in Ireland. It was the hub of the column still. And, you know, again, the hub of heavy industry in general, and the column still fit into that. But when you look at the definition, so, okay, and I know, Sergius, we've had this conversation in pubs. Grain whiskey in Scotland, by and large, is purity, high purity, low congener distillate distilled in columns, generally out of wheat or maize, generally wheat, but occasionally maize, you know, North British maize and etc. But legally, it can be anything. It's you know, Arbiki, when they put out their rye whiskey, they were obliged to call it single grain. If you made Redbreast in Scotland tomorrow, you'd be obliged to call it single grain. If you made malt whiskey in a column still, you'd be obliged to call it single grain. If you made Wild Turkey in Fife, you'd have to call it single grain. Single grain is a catch-all category in Scotland. Now, practically, when they say single grain, they mean the same stuff we do. Irish whiskey legislation is different because we've had to accommodate the existence of Irish pot still. And so we have it regulated specifically around the use of column stills. And there is this odd freedom that's there, because you look at the way, there's nothing about, you know, minimum purity or whatever. There's so much that could be done with grain whiskey in Ireland. And you look at the history of how it has changed. Now, it should be said, a lot of column still mash bill history was driven by hard economics. A lot of Irish pot still history was driven by hard economics, but column still even more. But it still shapes it no less shapes the history of what was made. You know, it's still an aspect of the drink. And yes, it's less congener retentive, so the mash bill means less than it would in, say, a pot still distillation. And we'll talk about this. Again, I want to give away what David's done. But the same question that was always there at the back of my mind, well, it's still different. You know, nevertheless, isn't vodka, you know, there is some, and this stuff is so bewilderingly different to contemporary Irish grain whiskey that you wonder, like, no. When the mash bill is that odd, it definitely tastes. I mean, people, even wheat, you know, 94% alcohol grain tastes different to maize, 94% alcohol.
Absolutely.
You look at what we're going to be talking about, and it is this strange, you know, a lot of Irish grain history is tagged to the birth of transatlantic economics as much as anything. So a lot of it's from abroad, but it's still a fundamental part of the history of the development of Irish whiskey and a part of the development of the industry. And Belfast was a central player, in fact, arguably the central player in terms of international grain sourcing. So it's all there, you know, and that's what attracted me to it. And David was probably the only person I've ever spoken to who copped that in a way that was as jazzy to him as pot still was to everyone else, you know.
Yeah.
So that was
David, Yeah. What was your reaction, David, when Fionnán brought the idea and the concept to you?
Yeah, well, I suppose fortunately or unfortunately, depending how you want to phrase it, I'm old enough to remember what was left of the bonded warehouses of what was the Collinswater Distillery, or to give it proper name, the Irish Distillery. And I'm also old enough to remember what was left of the Avonil Distillery. So my grandparents were from that part of the town. And it's one of those things, I actually didn't even realize there was a distillery in that part of Belfast until we actually started to do some research about our own distillery. And it kind of struck a chord because, of course, the sad thing about whiskey in NI, the North, whatever way you want to put it, was in the space of 2 generations, with the exception of Bushmills, we lost all of our heritage about distilling. And it sort of struck a chord that it would be great to sort of see what was actually there. And I know there's a project at the minute that's running called the Collinswater Greenway Project, and they're highlighting some of the industrial heritage about that part of town. And of course, all of a sudden, you've got Avonil Distillery, you've got Collinswater, which we're talking about here tonight. You have Secker's Cooperage. Hey, who told me? Who knew there was a cooperage in East Belfast? Never mind the fact there was 50 cooperages in the city at one stage. So it's funny how, like a lot of things in Belfast, there's glimpses of the past, but they're pretty much rubbed out and we're all looking to the future, whatever the future may be. But actually, in some ways, parts of the past, particularly the industrial heritage, are way, way more interesting than people actually realise. So when Fionnán sort of suggested having a look and play with this, I was like, yeah, 100%, let's dive straight in and see where we go.
Yeah. Of course, we're talking about one particular distillery really for this project in terms of, but there were so many, grain distilleries. I mean, you've Avonil, you've Watts, you've Collinswater, amongst others. And I think when it comes to Collinswater, it was a member of the UDC, which later was taken over by DCL from the Scotch, and then it was uneloquently shut down to support their own businesses, I guess. But these were not small distilleries. I mean, Collinswater was producing 2 million gallons a year. I mean, that's not a small amount.
UDC, if I remember correctly, had a combined output of 6 million between the sites, and Collinswater being the biggest. So at one point it was above 2 million by definition. And it was, it's a strange one because, it speaks to the sheer mass of grain whiskey that was being pumped out of Belfast. But then there's the question, the great mystery of like, where the hell did all this stuff go?
Well, that's the question.
I always assumed it was subsumed into DCL. So the ancestor company, Diageo, their Scotch portfolio. And it was only when Ian McMillan out in Scotland sent me a director's pamphlet saying it was subsumed that I copped it, that like there was a period where an awful lot of what you were drinking when you order a Hague was Belfast whiskey, brought over and just flushed into the system because they'd taken them over and shut them down. And you're still in the UK, it's still one industry, there's no regulation at that point, God no, in terms of what you can do internally, and so a lot of it was lost, but a lot of it turns up in the weirdest of places. And that was what attracted me a lot about Collinswater was with some of them, with the pot still series, with Cumber, you crack open a bottle of Old Cumber and you're like, oh right, this is what it was. Whereas with Collinswater and these grain distilleries, but nobody's where it went.
No, it just. But tell me, if the column still is so largely blamed and held responsible for being one of the main reasons for the downfall of Irish whiskey, how was it that there was such a big adoption of the column still up north, and yet the industry still floundered? So it gets a bad name.
And it's a strange one because, of course, there's the irony that, like, by the turn of the century, Ireland was producing more column still whiskey than it did pot still whiskey. The idea that they turned their back on it is ludicrous. What happened was a certain cabal of gentlemen distillers, largely centered in Dublin, and their peers around, whether that be Almonds or Locks, etc., saw it as a hostile incursion, and it's their history that has been remembered.
Yeah.
But there's also the great question of like, well, if the sob stories that Ireland refused to accept the column still and floundered, which is not true, there's the second question is, why did the Irish column still industry, which was enormous, fail before those pot still purists? Why was it all wrapped up by the 1920s and 30s, and they were still lumbering on into the 50s and 60s, at which point they eventually, what's left of them, form Irish distillers, build a new site, build a column still, the modern industry. So there's the question of why this happened, and to be honest, an argument I've always made is that it wasn't that Ireland turned its back on the column still. It was that Ireland refused to create a collaborative blending infrastructure in comparison to what happened in Scotland. What happened in Scotland, you had column stills, you had malt distillers. They originally didn't get along either, And a couple of months before the What is Whiskey trial, Andrew Walker, sonny boy of Johnny Walker, tours through the Highlands, and he explains to these distillers out in Talisker and Clynelish and these places, and says, I'm not your enemy. I'm your customer. And if I buy a little bit of you to flavor my blend, that's more money in a month than your crofting village is going to give you in a lifetime. And he was dead right. And it created this codependency within Scotch that the malt tradition was subsidized by the column stills. And that didn't happen in Ireland. The pot still distillers, by and large, told the column stills to jog on. You got the odd blip of Dunville's blending in-house. And then, but there was never any infrastructure. They hated each other. And I mean, David Lloyd George, bizarrely enough, wrote off the entire What is Whiskey trial as one more manifestation of quibbling between Belfast and Dublin. Scotland didn't even factor into it. It's like, oh, this is just, they can't get along, whatever. They disagree about anything. Red flag, blue flag. And there was that refusal. And Connswater is a good example of that what happened in Scotland was people forgot about malt whiskey for a century. The idea that everyone was, there's a book, there's a guy named Aeneas MacDonald, and that was a pen name. But anyway, he would often be regarded as the first of the 20th century whiskey writers. And he writes from a Scottish perspective, saying like, blended Scotch is not real Scotch. Whiskey is malt whiskey, the vineyards of the north, all this crap. So that sentiment was there in Scotland as well, that, the column still is a betrayal, blah, blah, blah. General Grant in Glenlivet had the same opinion. Andrew Mackenzie out in Dalmore had the same opinion, versus, say, Watts in Ireland, the column still. So when you look at the actual trial, it's splintered on both ends. But what happened in Scotland was you eventually got this collaboration, and that created blended Scotch, and it kept the malt producers alive. To this day, like, what is it, like 85% of Kalila goes into Johnny Walker, and that keeps the 15% alive as Kalila. That never happened in Ireland. And that's the failure the failure of Dublin and Belfast to get along is you can see, like Lloyd George's point, that there was this strange, now there was malt whiskey in rural Ulster, and there was Irish postil out in rural Ireland as well, and there was postil in rural Ulster as well. But
I mean, you only have to read Truths About Whiskey to see the disdain in which the columns
they despise them. And there's a lot of modern revisionism, where we're starting to say like, oh, they liked each other just fine, but it wasn't quite right for them. No, they did try to illegalize the columns, and that has to be remembered. They did. They did take them to court. They mucked about with them themselves once or twice behind the scenes. They nevertheless tried to, again, shut Irish column stills down by means of the court, if not by means of the market. When the market didn't work, they tried the courts. In fact, William Ross says this. He says, they have tried by means of the court to legalize a product which pleases the public. And it was ruthless, and it was industrial warfare. And it's a difficult story to tell. And Belfast is a good place. I mean, in the same way that Dublin wouldn't deal with Belfast, Bushmills wouldn't deal with Belfast. There was this culture clash between, producers and what they made. And it's a part of the history of Irish whiskey. It's a part of the history of Irish Mashbills and how they worked and what their logic was. And column stills, because they closed down, because they were rather ruthlessly closed down by another column still cartel again, DCL, Proto Diageo, shut them down on purpose because they recognized that the one big threat that Scotch had to fear from Irish whiskey was the creation of, and Ross says this, the big sleeping giant of Irish whiskey, which is dying, is the creation of Irish blended whiskey, cross-community blended whiskey, or cross-distillery blended whiskey. And this could be a real threat if it arises. And instead, you have these like petty blends made in house by Dunvilles and this and that, and that's nothing to worry about. But they essentially take UDC, which was Watts, Avenel, and Connswater, and close them down on site, absorb all the stock in the Hague, and yeah, that's a huge part of the history. And then there's that question of like the disowned child of Irish distilling, which is the titan of Belfast grain whiskey, and what the hell their logic was internally among themselves. And is that part of the birthright of Irish whiskey now? Yeah,
I mean, your name's synonymous really with pot still, Fionnán. Although you have shown a huge amount of interest in the grain distilleries of Belfast. I suppose particularly from the point of view that there were different mash bills used within these grain distilleries. And if you think of grain distilleries now, people tend to think, oh look, it's maize or wheat, and it's hugely the majority of that. But of course, grain whiskey can be made with malted barley only as well.
Yeah. Well, so here's the odd thing: is in Scotland, if you make malt whiskey in a column still, you cannot call it a single malt. Part of the discrete definition of a legal definition of single malt whiskey in Scotland is it has to be made in a pot still. Versus say Japan, where you have the like Nika coffee malt, where they ran it through a coffee still. That would if that was made in Scotland, it would be called grain whiskey. In the same way that rye whiskey, if it was made in Scotland, would be called grain whiskey. In the same way that redbreast, if it was made in Scotland, would be called grain whiskey. In the same way that wild turkey, if it was made in Scotland, would be called grain whiskey. Grain whiskey in Scotland is, again, practically what we call grain whiskey. High or low congener, high proof distillation column stills of a base. But in Ireland, the obsession was about the column still itself. In terms of legislation, because again, there was Irish pot still in the mix as well, and they're concerned about how everything gets legislated. So what we've ended up with is a category that really just says you have to run it through a column still. There's a 30% malt cap at the moment, and that's up for debate. So who knows if that stays or if it whatever. But even so, we've made it, by contrast, if anything, to Irish pot still, made it about the column still. Nevertheless, you look at bourbon, and like they run. I mean, well, not they, but the big bourbon still all run column stills, but they run it to very, very low, congener, or very high congener retention, very low ABVs.
Yeah.
Just you get every modern amenity.
Let's jump to David. A quick sec, if you don't mind, David. I mean, you established. Tell us a little bit about the history of Rademon Estate Distillery, how it came about, and how unusually, I suppose, you came to have both a column still and pot stills.
Yeah, I suppose. Well, my wife Fionnán and I, we got married back in 2011, and at the time I was spending a lot of time away from home, and I had wanted to be at home more as things were developing, and at the same time we were also wanting to do something for ourselves in terms of a business. And we love food and drink, in one sense. If we had the weather, we'd have had a vineyard, but hey, it's counting down, it's not Bordeaux. So Fionnán actually said, well, what about a distillery? Well, we love gin. We'll look at making gin. And this sort of linked back to an idea Fionnán had about probably 15 or 20 years ago, when her mum and dad acquired Rademon Estate, about building a distillery here. And I think she'd been reading the book by Townsend on the lost distilleries of Ireland. And that's sort of like, Jesus, this is part of our history that we didn't even know existed up north, and unfortunately her dad said, no, behave. There's more important things to do than think about distilleries. And that idea just sat until we got married. And then when Fionnán suggested it, I have to admit, I was quite skeptical. I wasn't, is this an industry I want to do? Do I want a career change and all those sorts of things? And but when we started out visiting distilleries, doing courses in brewing and distilling, I suppose, if I'm honest, particularly when we were in the States, we fell in love with this idea of a craft distillery. And during our research, the last places we actually visited were actually the distilleries in Ireland. So as we were gearing up to look towards producing our gin, we ended up with a still setup that was pretty much driven by sort of the craft movement in the States, which was a hybrid still of pots and columns. So this idea started way back for us back in 2011. So I think nice picture of our bar at the distillery.
This is, I suppose, what you are known for primarily originally, the Shortcross gin, which was a huge success and all made on site, and a huge success, which I suppose has enabled you to do side of things.
Yeah, so we ended up with a still with 2 columns for doing our gin, and then just before we launched our launch Shortcross, we were in the States and we saw a conference in Seattle with the American Distilling Institute, and that was back in sort of March 14. And just before we launched, we sort of realized, hey, if we're going to make a business out of this, we're going to need to look at other products. So this idea of starting whiskey started off with, like, what else do we make? And we always believe that you should make what you love. I happen to love malt whiskey. So we said, well, what else do we need to be able to make malt whiskey? We've got a beautiful copper pot still that we can operate in a number of ways. And the simple answer was we need to be able to make beer, because in essence, whiskey is nothing more than distilled beer, less the hops. So we spent a year, designed and fabricated our brewing plant. And then in summer of sort of June 2015, we actually started to produce our first malt whiskies. But all through this, aside from doing what we've done on the malt whiskey side, I have had this itch to be able to use my columns.
Yeah.
With Fionnán could have said, yeah, well, what about this project? Or what about Connswater? I thought, yeah, well, you know what? I can do it in pots and it'll be legal. But at the minute, I can't use the columns because it's a prohibited still design if I use the columns. So we've done the pots and we really, really loved it. In fact, as we'll see today, it's a really, really great distillate. And then we said, well, what about a comparison? Why not look at comparing same mash bill, same brewing conditions, same operating conditions, but hey, we'll actually distill with the columns in a batch manner and see whether or not it affects the distillate. So that's probably kind of a fast forward to where we've got to. Fionnán, sorry if I stole your thunder there.
No,
okay, so essentially, we're going to be talking. Look, let's spill the beans. We're going to be talking about a Connswater mash bill. How did you come across this, Fionnán, and what's the story behind it, and what's the composition?
Yeah, I mean, the Jemisin sued them. That's how I came across it. The hostility from pot still, and particularly certain prestige Dublin distillers against Belfast, produced a lot of material, and it's in the What is Whiskey trial itself. It's in the Islington case beforehand, blah blah blah. So the column distillers were there, and they had to testify as well, and they in both cases, and blah blah blah. And so all this stuff comes out, and I knew that there was a history of maize distilling because the Dunville's records make frequent allusion to maize sourcing, and that's the only. As I've said to Eckenville, who have the Dunville's brand now, when you go to Prony and you look at the Dunville stuff, it's just board meetings. It's the word whiskey is a dirty word. You don't see anything, but occasionally they refer to maize sourcing, and so this has been around for a long time. And Connswater was always an interesting one because you had 3 big column stills in Belfast, and then the one in Derry, and then the one in Dundalk. So you had that industrialized northeast hubbed at Belfast. And the ones in Belfast would have been Avonale, the Irish Distillery, and the Royal Irish Distillery. And two of those 3 became UDC along with Watts out in Derry. But you had this scene. And again, when you look at Alfred Barnett's tour of Ireland, there's a lot of fuss made by myself, among others, about his tours of the old Irish pot still distilleries. But he goes up north and he goes to Belfast. And of the 3, Avonil turned him away. They were actually the only distillery in the then United Kingdom that refused entry to Alfred Barnard. So that place was sketchy as all hell. And then you have, like grain whiskey just like thumped on the market. And then he goes to Connswater, and it's the same setup, a column still, blah, blah, but they're incredibly proud. And they say, we have the latest type of still, we have the latest setup, we have this, the no expense spared, the most modern of equipment. And for me, those two, that contrast between Avonil and Connswater summed up the history of grain distilling in Ireland. That's strange. On the one hand, you have the really uber sketchy, whatever, the people that Truths About Whiskey was written about, this like thumping well of mass-produced grain alcohol, and the other who saw it as, in the same way that like Harlan Wolff would have shown him around the shipyard saying like, we have the latest of everything, and that contrast and that industrial raucous noise, and what's the taste of that scene and that space? And then you have Dunville's, the Royal Irish Distillery, who are making pot still and column still and blending them in house, But it was such an odd hiccup, and then you see this like thumpings of maize, thumpings of rye, which was an odd one. Far more, and again, heavily under discussed that rye played a much, 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 much heavier role in the history of Irish grain whiskey than it did in Irish pot still. And Irish pot still was never more than 5%. It was always a little sprinkling, kind of a pepper effect. Whereas in column still whiskey, 30 to 40% kind of stuff. And there's even a history of malted rye via DCL of like essentially tricking people into thinking column still was pot still and the other way around. So there's two histories of Irish grain whiskey. One is the history of these old Belfast titans, and then the other is Irish pot still distillers like Jameson in their various points of desperation who mucked about with column stills, and they just run the pot still through it. Or you get like Bushmills who ran columns through Coleraine and ran essentially a barley-based grain whiskey because that they were using their own stock. But that's kind of needs as must history of Irish grain whiskey, and it survives through the kind of stuff that goes into Blackbush, the GPL and this stuff. But there is that lost history of people who made grain whiskey on purpose is the way to put it, and they were based in Belfast. And their history is largely untold, and that's always been interesting to me.
And then when it comes to the recipe, Fionnán, obviously, grain whiskey can have the same complexity in mash bills that pot still and any other whiskey can have as well. The myth that it can be just plain one grain and that's it is a fallacy. So how did you come across the actual recipes?
Lawsuits.
The lawsuits had the recipes in them.
Lawsuits, the What is Whiskey trial. Again, the Coleraine stuff is quite easy to track because Bushmills reference it themselves. And the same way, like Bushmills, before Bushmills was part of IDL, they had their own. There was 2 malt distilleries, 3 at a push. There was Bushmills, Coleraine, and Colerane's weirdy little side branch called Killowen, funnily enough. And I remember Brendan calling me up once saying, was there a historical Killowen? Because he didn't know. And nobody knew. And it was really like a little Coleraine distillery batch lab, and eventually Bushmills bought Coleraine and turned Killowen into a bottling hall. So a tiny little blip. But anyway, malt whiskey in Ireland was really confined to the North Coast. But Bushmills bought Coleraine, absorbed their malt stocks. That's why Bushmills, pure malt Bushmills is actually quite difficult to find, because when Bushmills absorbed Coleraine, they started pouring Coleraine into it. So technically it's a vatted malt that you get even before the advent of blended Bushmills. And then they installed a column in there and started making their own grain whiskey. Yeah. And because they were running from Coleraine and Bushmills that were malt distilleries, they started running barley through these. And that's why Blackbush to this day has a grain whiskey made of barley, because they were when they became part of IDL, it became necessary. By 1978, Coleraine's closed down. You centralize, and it said there was a product made in Middleton that could replace it. There's this whole, history of grain whiskey, but there's 2 histories of grain whiskey in Ireland. There's one is malt and pot still distillers who did it under duress through their own system. There's the other, which was the history of people who, again, set out to make grain whiskey on purpose. And their history is very different, And That's what we were looking at for Connswater. You know, a broken history, a history that hasn't seen the light of day since Dunville's folded in the 1930s. You know?
Yeah, I think we had this discussion once, Fionnán, where we talked about the fact that, you know, up north there are very few remnants left of any closed distilleries, and you attributed that really to the successful economic conditions of the north, and that they could afford to shut them down and clear them out. So we don't have any.
Well, it's the same to a significantly lesser extent in the urban south. You know, it's hard to find a distillery remnant in Cork than it is in Offaly, because if you go out to rural areas, there just wasn't the money to knock them down, so you get a whole building. But East Belfast, as the industrialized hub of the island, it's the hardest. Because and there's still structures there, but you know, you look at, like, I remember looking for the Cromac distillery, and I had to cross the lagoon and look backwards at the place, because the front is like a Polish food shop and a dojo, and you had to go across the backward side and look back and see there's a bit of wall there that is clearly not of the same time period, you know. But very, very little left in comparison to some of the, you know, likes of Monasterevin or Kilbeggan, of course. You know, Locks was kept basically as is, you know.
Yeah. Okay. Do you want to give us a recipe then for these Fionnán the Connswater recipes, and David can tell us how the process of actually producing it.
So the actual, when there's a lawsuit in Islington, London, that leads to Kirker and Greer having to confess where they got the stuff. Of course, Kirker and Greer were the Belfast bonder, along with Mitchells, not Mitchell and Sons Dublin, but different Mitchells. The Mitchells that are all over the Duke of York.
Yes.
Co-venture, and they would have been getting it from Connswater. And so in the midst of that lawsuit, they have to kind of fess up and say, this is where we got it, and this is what it's made of. And you look at and it's funny again, and there's a whole argument as to why this happened, but you're talking about like a quarter malt, roughly, and about 20% malt. But what was interesting to me was it's a sphere, and I gave David that sphere to choose from, you know, and it's in one sense broad and the other sense specific, where you're talking like 37 to this kind of stuff, 27 to such and such. And so I gave David free rein within that to kind of pick a space, because of course, driven by the market, you know, all Mashbills were a little bit variable. You're talking about vibrating lines. But you're essentially talking about a mix between malt, rye, and maize. Not unlike bourbon, funnily enough, independently across the way, but through a different system. High, and again, like rye takes a very, 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 I mean, trad bourbon, you know, never mind like Four Roses high rye bourbon. Your traditional bourbon is around 12% rye, which is much higher, you know, so, but using the same sort of logic. So there is this weird overlap between how people arrive at the same decisions. So I'll leave it with David to say where he took that.
Yeah, so I suppose we had the sort of the three cereals of the maize, the rye, and the malt, and the only thing that we couldn't get to fully replicate the recipe was raw rye. So we actually used malted rye in the mash bill. And one of the things that we said was, okay, we're going to do this, but we're going to follow our standard brewing process. So we mashed this pretty much as we would for a pot still mash or a malt mash.
Yeah.
And then we sort of looked at it. In this instance, for this, the first trials that we done were for pot still distillation. So we used the same yeast, same fermentation regime. So I think this is about 155 hours. Yeah, so this will be sample one, which will be the one with the pink label.
For those who actually got this stuff in weird packets, and Paul told me the 2 stacks packet, odd packets in the festival had, in fact, I saw a comment on Facebook that said, did anyone else in Belfast Whiskey Week get a sample of Rademon gin that does not taste like gin? Because he didn't label them.
Well, I don't want to seem like Crocodile Dundee here, but that's a bottle.
Grain whiskey, grain.
Yeah. So look, as I pour this out, and if anybody else has their samples there, they might want to start pouring. And I get so number one is
This is the pot still distillate.
Number one pot still, okay.
Yeah,
Grain whiskey
it was really
pot.
interesting that I suppose from an industrial aspect, when we went through the brewing process for this, even though it's 50% maize, it's just how much higher the yield was. Like,
Right.
We're looking 5 to 10% higher yield. So straight away, you go back to that industrial heritage, you can see why the Belfast grain distilleries would have been using maize. It just gives such a lift. But I was a bit skeptical because of the maize that when we distilled this, it was going to be quite neutral. I wasn't expecting it to be very flavoursome, very rich. I was expecting quite a light distillate, even though we were distilling it in pots.
Yeah.
And I have to say we were quite pleasantly surprised. So, if everyone wants to stick their nose in, I suppose, and get their glass of good swirl.
You know, we get these
For me-
Belfast week like Obsidian, the Borg drink whiskey glasses. Am I the only one who's got this like pitch black thing?
It's for
I can see what I'm drinking.
So for me on the nose, the first thing I get is actually that sort of crisp malt note, but then I start to get sort of those the fruity notes, a little bit of light pepper to start to come through. Sort of the rye starts to sit upon something a little bit sweet, and I find that the maize are just as very buttery. It's creamy. It just softens the whole nose. But as I look in the glass, it's the amount of oils that are actually in the new maker, the distillate. You can just start to see how maize actually can start to contribute things like mouthfeel and body to the whiskey.
I mean, there's on the nose. I know we don't really talk about heat on the nose, but there is no heat on the nose at all with this. This is very, cotton woolish.
You ever had a cucumber sandwich?
Yes.
No. Oh, okay. Well, I was not of the social class who got cucumber sandwiches, but I remember trying one for the first time and being amazed by how bland it was. There is that weird like cucumber smell off of it. It's the fruitiness doesn't manage to be fruit. It manages to be that weird, like, again, cucumberness, that strange, like watery, slightly herbal. Not herbal, or people think herbal is like thyme and things, but there's that weird like crispness, I think you called it, on the nose, and then you drink it and you get that like soft, I say butteriness, but it's not the pot still butteriness. It's not the like mouthfeel, gorgy butteriness. It's just a softness. And it's still, and for those who didn't quite cop it, so we distilled, or well, not we, David distilled in pots and columns. So this is an Irish grain whiskey recipe that was run through a pot, despite the fact that Irish whiskey legislation now mandates that Irish grain whiskey is run through a columns. This is taking the same mash bill, and all I wanted was someone with little columns to do this for us. And David came back saying, like, we'll do it through pots, and then we'll do it through columns, and see if we take a column still mash bill and run it in the same way that, again, like the infamous GPL and all these were Irish pot still mash bills run through columns backwards, because you have that weird history of, like, again, Irish pot still distillers who were obliged to run columns at one point or another start running their malt, their pot still mash bills through them. But then you also, have this loophole that, like, what if you did it backwards? So this is not the Connswater. This is Connswater done through pots, which is even more odd. But that's where we want to start.
Yeah. And tell me, what were the challenges of producing this, David? First, I suppose, rye is pretty sticky stuff and pretty difficult stuff to work with. And, I know you have long fermentation periods as well. Did you apply that to this as well?
Yeah, well, we had no issues with the rye. I think from our pot still brewing program, we sort of have figured out a lot of the issues with dealing with things like beta glucans and all wonderful things that you don't need to worry about when you're doing malt.
Yeah.
So the brewing side, bar one stock mash actually halfway through the sort of the program we were doing. We didn't have any real great issues.
Yeah.
Fermentation was fermentation, I say, follow what we would do normally, which is sort of 140 to 160 hours with this. But generally, actually, the mash behaved really, really well. It didn't give us any real technical challenges. So the real question was what it was going to distill like. And distilling wise, we did tweak our cut points a little bit, just to sort of hone in with the pot still side what we thought was going to produce a better distillate.
Yeah.
We didn't cut too late that it get too heavy or oily, because we could taste all the way. There was quite a bit of mouthfeel with the distillate.
Yeah. Yeah.
So no, it behaved fairly well.
Yeah. There's a sourness to this as well. Like, also, it's quite different to, a single malt new make for sure. But there is a kind of creaminess as well.
Yeah, it's a lot. Even though it's maize, it smells a lot less sweet.
Yeah.
But what I find is that it's the rye just sort of gives that real fruity twinge to it.
Yeah.
And that for me is what starts to get interest, especially with malted rye. You have components there that are quite complex with that cereal.
Yeah.
And I find it quite a fresh distillate. I think cucumber is actually is an interesting description, but I think it's the freshness that I would associate with a cucumber.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing is the amount of oils in the glass. That's when you start to go, oh, this is going to be a little bit different.
And is it more oils than you would get normally out of one of your Mashbills?
No, we would get maybe a little bit more, but our distillates, because they're double distilled, tend to be quite heavy and rich anyway.
Yes.
So, but it's a different type of oiliness.
Yeah.
But if I was to taste this.
And if anybody has any comments they'd like to make about it, I know there were over 150, 160 samples that went out in various packs. So other people have either drank them all already and are lying down or are just very quiet. But love to get your feedback on what you think of these. Fionnán, what are the notes do you get in this?
Of the first one?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a weird one because, again, it is, if you've ever had pot distilled bourbon, because, of course, bourbon is quite low ABV distilled. It's legally obliged to be under 80, but it's usually about half that. And there is a weird, the big thing is that weird like cucumber sandwich thing, that freshness, which is peculiar because you think, okay, maize, rye, low concentrate or high concentrate distillate, low ABV, it's going to taste weirdly like a bourbon, and it doesn't. It tastes like it is oily, not pot still oily, maizy oil. I mean, if you ever had corn whiskey, like actual corn whiskey, stuff that doesn't qualify to be called bourbon, and above 80% maize, not in virgin oak, whatever, you can have this the substance that holds tinned corn together, the like watery stuff in the middle, you can have that. Sometimes it can be really unpleasant, and sometimes it can be a bit strange and fun. And this slightly reminds me of the strange and fun stuff.
Yeah.
That weird like oil of a different kind, but then it manages to have that again, that cucumber freshness kind of lifts it out of that. So I'm a fan,
Paddy Duffy there is saying fruit and spice. Well, of course, I presume a lot of that spice is from the rye element.
Yeah. I find it's interesting. It's actually how long the finish is.
Yeah.
To me, it's so heavy, so sticky. It really claws to your mouth. And then I find the maize starts to come back, and sort of that sugar puff sort of cereal note comes through.
I actually get a little bit of almost like leek kind of flavor of it.
Yeah, it's a weird like potato pie kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know. It's really nice actually, and it doesn't have a burn. What's this? What percentage is this, David?
This is at 46.
46%. So you probably what would have come off the still at?
It came off the still about 70.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I have to say, personally, at
Mashbills.
we're fans of this one. We do think it is because it's different.
Yeah, no, it is very different. And it is long. It is long. Let's see. What does anybody else have any thoughts there? Graham has to recover it. There's a few people in there. So, I mean, there were a lot of sample packs that went out. So I think people are still looking for some of those actually as well. So they're wondering what box it's in. What are the other challenges then of this? It didn't clog up your pot still in any shape or form, or?
No, honestly, it was really, really well behaved. The challenge was just trying to create something that replicated or reflected our interpretation of what Connswater could be. I say we couldn't get raw rye, so we used malted rye. We're sort of on the limits for both the malt and the rye, but it is. I think the interesting thing was just trying to make sure that we'd done the mash bill sort of justice in terms of it as being as close to what it was historically.
Yeah. And when Fionnán gave you the recipe, were you able to provide any details about the cut? Was that lost?
No.
I mean, it's not. I mean, it's a column still, so they were high. This isn't a pot still, so it doesn't matter. It can translate. But the actual Connswater was running high grade.
Yeah. Coming off at 96 or whatever.
Cuts don't feature into it. Kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So this is almost a thought piece of this is not historical whiskey. This is what that column still might have tasted like had it come off the pot at 70%, which is less than what most pot still whiskey comes off in this country.
Yeah.
But I think there's that peculiarity in grain whiskey at the moment in Ireland that has the potential to be. Now it can't be made in pot. It has to be made in column still now. But there is the weird, could you be more conjunct or retentive about it? Could you do stuff that's not just incidental Cooley or incidental Great Northern or incidental Middleton columns?
Yeah, how would this be classified now, Fionnán? Off the pot still?
Irish whiskey.
Just Irish whiskey. Couldn't be called anything else. Yeah.
Grain whiskey is not pot still. Yeah, it's and there's no problem with that. This and this. I know the pot still thing has been put to bed. Thank God. And fair play to the people who the whole industry for dealing with it. There is a space for generic Irish whiskey, and this would fit in there very comfortably.
Yeah. Any plans then to release this, David?
Yeah, we have. I suppose the distillates now had about a year in the cask. So so this will be coming out somewhere along the way. I really like it. What for me is interesting with this is that we give grain whiskey in Ireland. We give grain whiskey such a hard time.
Yeah.
The farmers complain about the maize. People complain that it's too neutral. But all of a sudden, you start looking at some of these older mash bills, and I suppose when we look back at Belfast grain whiskey, we probably look back with sort of look down our nose at it and assume it's the same stuff that was being produced now. But it was obviously quite different, and you start to go, well, actually, how would this have aged in a sherry cask, in a port cask, in a fortified wine, or whatever they had at that time? Because if you actually look on the Connswater Greenway website, before the Connswater River was narrowed, you can see that they were bringing barrels and grain up and down the river to it. So
it was there for a reason. It was industrially central. They didn't pick the site at random.
Yeah.
Well, I think there's so many
permutations. The Campbell too. When you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this will be as closest to the historic reproduction of Connswater as it can get.
Yeah, so we redistilled this now. This time around, we did change the yeast for this. So we actually used the grain whiskey yeast, kept the mash bill the same, and went through the same fermentation process.
What did you use, like Anchor or?
Sorry?
What yeast did you use? Did you use Anchor or?
We used the Lalliman GW yeast.
Okay.
So what I find with the columns is on sample 2, which is the black label bottle for anyone that's
that one there.
Yeah. What I find with sample 2 is it really draws out the fruity notes from the rye. all of a sudden the rye is so much further forward.
Yeah.
Oh, it works. It's fun. It's strange. And I mean, you look at like most. I had a wonderful trip to Kentucky once where I talked to you about how does maize taste coming out of a pot still versus a column still versus high content retention columns versus low content retention. You know, if you run a column still, not trying to bleed out the ingredients, what do you get versus pot still around the same thing? And there was so much wonderful geekiness coming out of this knowledge base that has been lost in Ireland, or we've never had in Ireland for a lot of maize. You know, nobody made pot stills. Well, a few people may have it, and it was seen as an outlier thing in this stuff in the Midlands. But trying these two together, seeing the same mash run through one kit and the other, you know, and it's so fun. You know,
I mean, it's amazing how different they are, and yet there is something common through the two of them. And I think, you know, if you were to talk about your cucumber, that's still there to some element.
It works.
Yeah, but
breaks my heart to say it looks better than the column stills. You know, you get that.
It is better.
It is better in the column. Although saying that, you don't get the viscosity. I don't think quite the same.
There's a certain greasiness that, like a lot of American corn whiskey, you know, not bourbon, but corn whiskey, which is again a different category, above 8%. You know, maize and not aged in virgin oak. There is a weird, like tinned corn sensation that's not entirely pleasant for a lot of people, including myself. And here, but when you see corn refined, that greasiness gets refined into a lovely kind of mouthfeel. You know, it's a greasy, what we would think of single grain rather than greasy whiskey, full stop. And it works. It's heavier than grain whiskey as we know it, but it's still been refined, you know, and there's a lot of body there.
There's a lot going on in it.
That weird, like, you know, when you get bread at a restaurant, there's little bits and pieces stuck in it, you know, the real kind of fancy, like, I don't know what those herbs actually are, but they're sticking out of the bread. That kind of smell. There's that along with the cucumber. It still has this. You know, and it's funny because, of course, like column still whiskey, far more than pot still whiskey, both in Ireland and Scotland, homogenized during the 20th century to be one thing, wheat or maize, and 5% malt to get the go-ahead, you know. And there is that space. And maybe it was done through industrial pragmatism. Maybe it was just hard economics. Maize is dirt cheap. Rye grows yeast. All these various factors. This is coming up the bloody river, you know. But again, they still develop logic. They still develop a cohesive identity as liquid. And there's a weird, and especially mention of malted rye, there's a weird drop comment in the What is Whiskey trial where one company, I think it was even DCL themselves, talk about using malted rye and column stills to give body to the whiskey. And I always read this like, are they trying to pretend to be pot still, or what does give body to the grain whiskey mean? But you know, there's these little chance comments in the dark. But it does, you know, you get that. It is lovely. I mean, I've had grain spirit before, and you know, and as of you too. And there is, despite the fact that it's column, there's a lot more going on. But it's in some of the maize lead distillates, when you're running through a pot, it starts to taste a little engine oily. Whereas here, that has been refined just enough that it creates a new texture. It's not the pot still oiliness. It's not the classic, you know. Yeah,
but I think it's a little bit sweeter as well through the column still than through the pot still, which I'm kind of surprised at. I mean, I would have almost flipped these around, and if somebody said to me, "This one is this one, and this is the other," you know. It wouldn't surprise me if somebody said this is the column.
For trad pot drinkers is what it is. You know, Hendrix for trad pot drinkers. You know, that oily, but again, it's not the same oil. Like engine grease, but it's been calmed down, been thinned a bit, and then that weird cucumber thing. You know, it works though.
Yeah.
I think it's just. I think it's a good example of sort of belays the argument that all of produce bad whiskey.
So fingers crossed there is a charger waiting for me in another.
Oh,
podcast.
you're losing power. Yeah.
Everybody knows that power disappears quicker in Belfast than it does in Dublin. Your laptops are just drained.
Yeah. I think they're on the same number of sockets and everything.
Solution here. Yeah. It's just part of the.
Well, it's good we're getting a tour of the bar.
In the back.
Tell me, how is this different in production terms, David?
So
Other than the yeast.
The brewing process followed the same bar.
Sure, yeah.
We distilled on our original 450 litre still with both of the 7-plate columns engaged.
Yeah.
They turn into the two of you. Unfortunately, we're in a pub.
Okay. They don't have wireless electricity there then, no?
Oh, grand. Oh, jeez. Oh, my God. I'm blind as a bat. We're all saying.
Oh, wouldn't be. If anybody hasn't been to the Duke of York and they're looking for a mirror, there you go. Are you back?
Yeah. Oh, I've never left. Grand. Who would have thought Victorian? That's the difference between Dublin and Belfast. You get lovely Victorian pubs, but they've also got electrical sockets. You know, this is what happened. This is what ran the column still industry. Is the existence of electrical sockets in pubs in Belfast.
With their laptops.
That mix of tradition and forward thinking. Grand. Yeah. Nothing.
As Robert said, he doesn't know what he's more jealous of.
Has anyone been up to?
David, am I with you? Can you hear me?
I'm with you. Yeah, I think we've lost something on there.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted you there. Yeah. Beyond the fermentation and the brewing process, what was different? Obviously, you were using a column still, but what was the effect on the machinery? And how far did you have to deviate from the normal production methods?
So with the first sample, it was double distilled in pots. So a wash distillation followed by a spirit distillation.
Yeah.
With this one, it was a single pass, so it was through the pot still and then through the columns. And because it's batch operated as opposed to continuously operated, we actually make a set of cut points. We make a heads, a hearts, and a tails, or feints, hearts, or sorry, 4 shots, hearts, and feints cuts.
Yeah.
We would distill in the pot still whiskey. We went a little bit later on the tails than we would have liked, which is maybe added a little bit more breadiness. But straight away, when we were distilling this, the rye really jumped out.
Yeah.
You know, the fruitiness of the rye really shone through for us. So we're hoping that we're going to be allowed to produce whiskey using our columns on a batch basis sooner rather than later. It's something that's been proposed, so we're waiting to hear on that.
So just run that by me again. You want to be able to run columns in a batch process?
Yeah. So
okay.
We've been asking for this for about 4 years. So hopefully in the next few weeks, we're going to get the nod to be able to do that.
Yeah.
And, because I have to say now, one of the advantages as a distiller of using the columns is you get so much more copper contact.
Right.
So you actually get a much smoother, much sweeter distillate because of that. And I also think it's fun because it allows us to do some of the things that we want to do that we haven't been able to do.
Yeah. And did this come off the column stills at a really high ABV, or did you take it a slightly
just over 90?
Yeah.
I think the Hearts faction was about 86, 87, and then we reduced it down.
Very good. Very good. I think Fionnán, you're back.
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah. The tech is always better up here, but not too much better. You know,
you must have got a very long cable.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're all sorted now. Well, actually, I plugged it in and forgot to turn down the little clicker thing that said that the socket itself is on. Something I've never understood the existence of. Why is the socket always on when you want to plug something in there? But anyway, you have to turn the socket on as well as
That's
plugs.
to prevent little kids going around with keys and putting their fingers in sockets, you know.
I suppose, but those children are damned to kill themselves in some way or another. I don't see why we should be held back by.
Yeah, no, I mean they're both really, you know, of course when people think of grain, they think it's a less complex, more steady kind of spirit, if you like. But these have as much complexity and body in them as any pot still or any mash bill I've tried. You know, it might not have the gravity. Might be the only difference. You know?
It's also a question of like legally, there's nothing that I know of in Irish whiskey legislation that says grain has to be high ABV, that has to be low content or retentive. It's not there. There's unless it's been changed.
I thought it had to come off a column still above a certain percentage.
Not even about it has to come off a column still, but there's no mention of.
Sorry, column still. Yes, it has to come off column still. Was it 93?
There's a maximum, but no minimum.
That's maximums rather than minimums.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah.
Of how, so you look at like bourbon. Bourbon cannot be distilled higher than 80% alcohol. In fact, several prominent pot stills in Ireland come off often slightly higher than that.
Yeah.
And I remember there's a wonderful guy, Colin, out in Kentucky, who runs something called Moonshine University, which is a staff training facility within Kentucky. And I remember trying to ask him once, and I said, what strength does most bourbon actually come off? And he said, oh yeah, about half that. And it was flabbergasting to me to know that bourbon not only tastes slightly greasier because of but because it is actually taken off at a lower, despite the fact that a lot of it is going through columns. Thus, I know a lot of craft distillers are making pot distilled bourbon now, but there is that weird incongruity that if you distill something in a pot and a column, and again, like columns run to speed, the way we think of columns in Ireland and Scotland is run columns as they're designed to be run. You know, run them and keep very little, but in America, they're run, and they have to be run to roughly the strength of Middleton, you know, and you think, well, okay, that's a column, but all the same, you know, because when all this gibberish around double distilled and American whiskey being single distilled doesn't mean anything because they're using different types of stills. Yeah. But there is that same, and again, like what can be in some corn whiskeys in America, are very greasy, kind of, I don't find entirely pleasant. When refined out, becomes what goes into that virgin oak, is the shock bang of vanilla and so forth, and becomes bourbon, and it all starts to make a lot of sense. And here, it's been weird to see that like Irish overlap and how the contexts overlap, and then see them just as spirit and have pot distilled, column distilled, but again, like relatively high content or retention across both in comparison to what we really think of as grain whiskey.
Yeah. So if I was to talk about, there's one question that's stuck in my mind is, what kind of cask could you mature this in, David?
Well, I put this in the virgin oak.
Virgin oak?
Yeah.
Speaking of bourbon.
Yeah.
Yes.
But why not? You know, it works for bourbon. It's maize high. There's a good element of rye. And hey, maybe I'll get a Irish bourbon equivalent cast back at the end of all this, you know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, could you see it finishing in another type of cask?
Yeah, I could see this with a bit of sweetness and a bit more body from the cask. I could see this going into something like a sherry or port cask.
Yeah.
Well, I only concern would be maybe it would get to the point where it's too sweet.
Yeah.
So definitely red wine's out, but maybe port, maybe a drier style of sherry.
Yeah. And in terms of actually using this as a component of a blend, is that a possibility? That
like you know, we produce malt, we produce pot still, we produce a few other things. The one thing that we haven't talked about is the opportunity for do a blend of all our pot still distillates. Yeah. And then what is it? Oh, at the end of the day, I just want to make Irish whiskey. I'm not too concerned about the sub-label or subcategory. I just want to make Irish whiskey.
Yeah. Could there, and I don't know if this has been done or not, and maybe Fionnán, you can correct me on this, is there a possibility of a peated grain whiskey?
Oh, stop it. But peated implies you've malted something, and malt tends to be quite low in.
You could have a 25% malted barley, or 10% malted barley, just to see, or even malt. If you talked about other mash bills, you could do peated oats and put it through a.
I'd be curious because I remember being there on the day. Like two of the most innovative products in Ireland are the Great North. Well, they're the same product in premise. Great Northern Distillery triple distilled peated malt and Teeling triple distilled peated malt.
Yeah,
they're just on different sites. And I remember being there the day that Alex was running one of the prototypes for what's now the black pits.
Yeah.
And it was a waste of time, blah blah blah. We needed peatier malt for this than now. And then subsequently to that, they got really, really peated malt. And around that, and that seems to have been what black pits is made of. But I happened to be interviewing Alex on a day that like one of the lead ups was going on. And there was the idea that like you're peating it and you're bleeding it out. And column stills, if run to efficiency anyway, will be doing the same thing even more. The kind of like, why would you bother? Let alone if you had 25% of the mash bill was that, let alone the whole thing. And then you're running it through a column still. Even a high content or retention distillation where you're not running the column still to efficiency. Would you? And Loch Lomond have peated grain whiskey.
Yes, Frank Murphy there.
Again, like there's a weird, the Scottish regulation is so odd that like anything run through a column still is grain whiskey in Scotland. Full stop. You could run single malt through a column still, you're still making grain whiskey in Scotland. Whereas Ireland's paranoid because of history, because of the pot still and so forth, is the other way around, where you could, it doesn't matter what you do. Your grain whiskey has to be made in a column still, full stop. You can't make grain whiskey in pot still because there's the existence of Irish pot still by contrast. So they both claim to be like natural law, fucking, genus, species, etc. denominations, but they're about the histories of the industries, really.
Yeah.
There's the question of like, well, there's a reason nobody ever made peated malt through a column still, even at a low content, even a high content or retention, low ABV distillation. Would it work? Is anyone willing to try it? I don't know. It'd be fun, but again, like you're not even talking about like Lefroy wash run through a column still. You're talking about like by legislation at the moment. Under 30% malt content, unless you're fucking beating the maize itself.
Yeah.
For the crack of it, what you would get. So I think it's very difficult to come up with peated single grain under the current context. It's almost impossible in Scotland. Extremely difficult in Ireland.
Yeah. But I mean, with the apparent changes in the legislation around mash bills and what you can call them, and, the flexibility that you have there with the column still, it surely opens up a whole massive new area of all these new permutations of what could be done in the future.
Yeah, totally. There's, what will be the revised GI and even the GI as it is, there's so much flexibility in it already, but you just have to look to that generic class of Irish whiskey to realize you can pretty much have your party because you're back to the three basic rules of the Irish Whiskey Act.
Yeah.
And if you look at it that way, I'm a glass half full sort of person. I look at the positive and I just think, all these labels and sub-labels are great, but I just want to produce whiskey.
Yeah.
And, and that, if you look at it in that way, I think you just go, actually, there's opportunity to innovate and try just about anything you want. And,
there's a comment there, and that's not actually true. For bring it back, a lot of Middleton pot still is brought off at 85%, but actually single grain is brought off in the low 90s. It is definitely in Ireland. 85%. So a lot of it's odd. So triple distilled pot still in Ireland comes off. So you take because I noticed from my own thesis experiment, trad pot tends to come off around the 78 to 80% when you're talking about tailsy triple distilled pot still distillate, and up to 85 for light pot. But column distilled grain whiskey on definitely comes off in the low 90s. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Guys, will we try the last sample just to contrast all of this?
Now, one thing I have to say, David, about there's a common thread that runs through all the new makes that I've had from Rademon Estate, and that is that there is a fruitiness there through all. Is that something you have been by design, or just something that happens?
I suppose for us, as I said on Sunday, we're all about flavor, and we believe flavor starts with the mash bill, and it starts with the brewing fermentation process. So I believe, or we believe as a team here, that by going out to those sort of extended fermentation periods of 140 to 160 hours, when we start to get that secondary fermentation, the autolysis of the yeast, that all breaks down. We see that richer depth of flavor come across, and because we're double distilling with, we believe we get a much richer, fruitier, and I suppose in many ways a more mature new make.
Yeah.
Than what we would get if we were maybe going with a fermentation of the sort of the standard 60 to 70 hours, and part of it is by design, part of it's by luck, because it's we always believe in life it's better to be lucky than good, and it delivers for us. And I think with good quality copper, which we have on our stills, we think it produces a fantastic product. And
you're out in the lovely countryside out there as well, which I'm sure has a significant role in all of it as well.
Yeah, well, I think our water is very, very mineral rich, which gives us other issues. But yeah, it actually helps with the brewing side. We are just so lucky where we are. We'd be the first people to say that. At the height of summer, now that we can get people back on site, we would argue that there's no more beautiful on a sunny day than the visit of the distillery than here at Rademon. But there's just so many.
Have you ever been to Hawaii, David? Out of curiosity.
What? Sorry,
I was saying, have you ever been to Hawaii?
No, I want to though.
Yeah.
But no, it's
wow.
There's features. So this next sample, if you guys have, it's number 3. It's labeled as, what did I label this as? You'll have to wait and see. So it's the bottle number 3 with the white label, guys. Yeah. So this is actually a sample of our new make malt spirit, but it's our new make malt with crystal malt. So this is a mash bill that we have been running for about 5 years now. And it was our first experiments with deviating away from just non-peated malted whiskey can only be made from distilling malt or plain malted barley. And if I'm honest, we probably think about brewing and fermentation more like brewers than we do distillers, because we're looking for flavor and ester formation. So for me, the crystal malt in this mash bill just makes such a difference. When we brew it, it's so much richer in color. It's really, really dark. Fruit-wise, I get a certain banoffee note that's really apparent when we actually distill it, especially as we go from our heads to our hearts. But it's really quite rich and fresh. There's lots of fruit in there.
It's really fruity, very, very fruity, and very viscous as well.
I had to eat a shit, and I can say this is a totally different side of my life. I had to eat a shit, banoffee cake recently. And when you get the bad ones, there's that weird, it smells like the crust as much as it smells like the banana itself. And in the best of all possible ways, as a compliment, this smells like that, where you're getting that crust as well as the banoffee. Weird.
There's a real normalized sweetness there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a tingle on the nose as well. Yeah.
The sweetness is really there up front. It's quite a rich, very, very oily mouth coating. Distillate.
Oh, it's very oily. Very oily.
And then just sort of that light malt spice towards the end of the palate.
I haven't tried it yet. There's so much going on in the nose there. I'm trying to pinpoint, but I mean, David, you've done a lot of experimentation. You do a lot of things very differently, and as you said, you did this 5 or 6 years ago. You kept very quiet about all this experimentation. It's only, I suppose, in the last couple of months that we're really finding out what you've been tinkering with up there. And here was me thinking you were, laying down standard single malts, but you actually have been tinkering a lot.
Yeah, well, we're
David's a gem. It's amazing. It's the quiet Ulsterman stereotype. You had to come up and find the fucker. He was making brilliant stuff for years, and again, I've lugged the Irish Whiskey Society. I've lugged people up to talk to David, and he sells himself short. I mean, some of the stuff is fantastic, And I know this is a fun project that you did for the magazine, but honestly, anyone who hasn't been ear to the ground, paying very, very, very close attention, now is the time to pay attention, because Rademon, of the 30 new distilleries in Ireland, I would easily put in the top 5. You guys are doing fantastic stuff. It's fun. It's upbeat. The pot still, I know we're talking about Colin tonight. Your double distilled pot still is gorgeous. That weird peach fudge stuff that comes off. It's there's a lot going on, and I think as you mature, people will start to know. There's again that weird hiccup that happens before you exist, and there's a lot of people in Ireland pushing forward distillate that hasn't been tasted, and they've got effective branding and they've got effective marketing, and the product. I hate to use words like product. The spirit doesn't really pull its weight. And what I was trying to do for the past 3 years was talk to people about their distillate, and there's a few of them, and they're now coming out, and a lot of them are from County Down. And when I say a lot of them, I mean 3 of them, and you're as much at the front as any of them is a kind way of putting it. You're doing something.
You've been very patient, actually. Yeah, I mean, you haven't released a whiskey before you believe it's ready. When can we expect, as I think Connor is alluding to here, how long do we have to wait for this one to be out?
Well, I'm hoping we're going to do our first release. We will be doing our first release in Q4 this year.
Okay.
Exact timing is going to depend on supply chain and all that good stuff. But yeah, it's going to be this year, and we're in the fortunate position where we don't have to decide it or be limited to it's going to be a pot or it's going to be a malt whiskey. We still haven't decided what we're going to go with. But that's that's just part of the romance now with it. We've done the science. We're 3 warehouses full of whiskey. We've another warehouse that we're building at the moment, and they're good problems. But we are quiet and reserved. But I suppose we don't know how good it is. We believe in what we do, but we don't know how good it is compared to what other people is. So what you and Fionnán are saying is it gives us a lot of encouragement. So thanks, guys. And we just want to share what we're doing with everyone now, and this is part of the fun of doing this project.
Yeah, there's not many that would take the risk to do, or not many that would take the risk and the time and the effort to
grain whiskey,
like this, So I'm sure Jonathan's thrilled as well with this.
I'm delighted, and it's been lots of fun, and it is strange to look back, and it's how we draw from the well of the past, because again, a lot of Irish grain, Irish pot still whiskey is drawn up at high ABV percentages, high purity levels. Yeah. Again, when we're doing the formal part of the thesis, as came up before, we had to draw from the tails air cuts, which is like 78, in triple distillation, and really up to 85 with a mixed mash Irish pot still distillation. And when you look in the column still stuff, it tends to be about 90 to 94, and to see what this would be in a pot still distillation, let alone a low ABV, high content retention column distillation, it is such a no man's land of what Irish whiskey can be, what Irish grain whiskey can be, what the generic category can be. You know, there's and for all that, what I'm most excited about, being the like little pot still fanboy that I am, is your pot still and how fun it is. You know, we're not drinking tonight. You know, and you've done so much so quietly. It's difficult to express how much fun stuff is happening. You know, Belfast, historically, Dublin was the, you know, heart and soul of pot still, and Belfast was the heart and soul of grain, and yet County Down has embraced pot still so heavily. It's just all the sand is in the north. You know, not all the sand, but a lot of the sand is in the north. It's so fun to see. You know.
There's a question in there from Robert. I think it's a valid question.
From Dublin.
From Australia. Well, from Dublin, yes. So he's asking, do you think the single grain category can be narrowed down and been more specific, like they do in America, where they, you know, or then are we just going to confuse people too much, or does it matter?
Our single grain category. I'll put it this way: our single grain category is already much narrower than Scotland, despite the fact that when people say single grain in Ireland and Scotland, they largely mean the same thing, you know, tacitly, which is high confusing these words. High ABV, low congener retention, distillate, largely used for blending. That's the tacit understanding for most consumers, for most people, but it's not legislatively the difference between Irish and Scotch grain whiskey. I don't know how well Irish grain whiskey is served by being even narrower. I think there's a wonderful space, and I know, like, I'm change of tune. I used to rail about the pot still GI when it was wrong, and now it's to the credit of the industry being changed. I don't know how well served we are to broaden the category of grain whiskey, because at a certain point it just becomes generic whiskey, which is what it is in Scotland legally. Legally in Scotland, anything that's not within the malt, grain, malton blend formula is grain nevertheless. And in Ireland, because we have this rich mash bill tradition, we have had to accommodate the existence of Irish pot still as a separate thing. We have this idea of grain whiskey as being, and it's all grain. What the hell does grain whiskey mean? They're all made of grain, you know. But if we're going to have categories, at least keep them the way they are. But I think there is a space for grain whiskey to be fun, to be strange. You know, and if I saw it subsumed in the generic category, I wouldn't, you know, cry too many tears. But as long as there's space for both of them to be fun, or for one of them to be fun, I don't care. You know, because there's a lot of space outside, and you look at again the history of Irish grain distillation, largely ground in Belfast, shows all this bizarre stuff that was coming from abroad, anyways. You know, it's the history of hard economics. So I understand the provisions around protecting unique pot still Irish mash bills, the weird like malt and raw barley, oat, and other showmanship in high congener settings in a pot still. I totally get that, coming from a historian's background, and from just a lover's background. But I think there's a lot of space for grain, and I think it is a tragedy, an absolute mind-boggling tragedy that there is to this day not a whiskey distillery in Belfast. And I would love.
Well, there will be. There will be.
Yeah,
I mean,
Belfast deserves
we're only down the road from Belfast, so don't worry.
Oh, great. Okay, Rademon. I'll take Rademon. Because there's this hotbed between yourselves and Ecklenville and Killowen. You've become this strange nucleus. First of all, of Irish pot still. Like, you're doing double distilled pot still, Ecklenville doing double distilled pot still, Brendan is doing peated pot still. There's all this odd stuff happening up in this space. And it was a quiet. Well, Brendan's a loud enough guy at the best times, but Jarlath only slightly less so. But you guys were so quiet for so long, and the stuff you're doing is so fun. You know, I feel embarrassed as a dub coming up to Belfast to talk about pot still because the genius seems to be radiating, and we've got fun. We've got Teeling doing fun pot still. But there's a lot, and Pierce Lyons are doing their bit, and mucking about. But it is undeniable how a city and an area that was famous for grain whiskey, which is what we're drinking tonight, became so cool for pot still, and has the opportunity to become so cool for grain as well. But
well, I think these grains, and I've tried, a good few grains, and for me as a new make grain, this has far more layers in it, far more complexity, far more flavor than anything I've tried. And I'm assuming you're going to continue pursuing different types of mash bills outside of the normal, David.
Yeah, well, if I've already alluded to, I'm a big fan of the broad house that is the generic Irish whiskey classification.
Good man.
And I think the broader the house, the less the rows there are, the less fights, and the more we can all come together. So, we've worked hard, and we've some really, really, really good stuff that we haven't spoken about.
Yeah.
If you think I was secretive about Pete, guys, I have something else that I'm even more secretive about.
I was on you for years trying to get your bloody pot still, let alone like the stuff you were quote unquote public about, let alone the secret projects. No,
they're outstanding. They really. It's all very well doing something different, but something different that actually tastes phenomenal and is interesting as well. It's a different. Yeah. It's a different thing. I could make something very complex as well, but I wouldn't give it to my dog. Actually, I don't have a dog, but if I had a dog, I wouldn't give it to my dog.
The animal.
Yeah.
Well, look, guys, can I just say thanks to Fionnán for sharing the Connswater mash bill as part of his research, because as much as if I'd known I could get my hands on it, I wouldn't have known where to look. So, Fionnán, thanks, because you're the catalyst for allowing us to do this experiment. So, look, thank you from Fiona and I and the team here at Rademon.
Pub chat stuff. The distillate stuff counts. What you guys do that matters.
Yeah. I think it is important. That's why and Fiona will be modest in this, but that's why his research is so important. And not only that, the research, he's been so generous with sharing, those recipes with people that would have, I have no doubt in my mind, these recipes would have been lost, bar one or two that might have been found somewhere. But, and we're honored that, that you choose to share those in our 7 Sip series and the talks.
Have you asked all the other girls to dance yet? Or am I the last?
No, you're the last in the queue. You're the last in the queue. We're going to cut you off in a minute.
Look, guys, the one thing I'd say is, there's no point having history if we don't share it and we don't pass it on.
Yeah.
So,
but it's fun. And as you said, put it in Virgin Oak, play around with it, And Jack's there. So for those who don't know, there was the hyper formal pot still event earlier. So a large part of the PhD is about the resuscitation of Irish pot still mash bills and their ABVs and their cut points and so forth. And it wasn't deployed by me because I was a fucking basket case. I was pissed off and worried. It was Jack and Michael Fogarty and Brian Green who really made that happen. They were the ones actually, while I was weeping to my shirts wondering if we had enough fucking people and blah, blah, blah. And Dave, you were a panelist on that. The first the Belfast leg of that. We did
really well done, guys. Well,
you're a panelist on the tasting. You're also on the tasting committee. On the technical committee for the Irish Whiskey Association, aren't you?
Yep. And it's
so now we can interrogate you now that we have you. No.
The most important thing is that there's a feeling that there was going to be a big bonfire about amending the GI, the technical file and all that stuff. But actually, to be fair, those that have been involved have actually came together, and the general consensus has all been positive. There's not been any rows or any teddy bears or handbags at dawn. And I think Fionnán's research was referenced by more than one company and provider. And I think, see, when You know what? This is going to be revision 2 of the technical file. It'll revise again, but this is the first step, I think, to opening the church to everyone. And I think it's going to be good. The industry will be better for it. Hopefully, people can see the big picture is the change is good, and people don't get lost in the detail that don't matter. The most important thing is getting the 5% other cereals to 30%.
Yeah.
That's the golden metal for it all. And people shouldn't lose sight of that.
And I mean, look, I've got not to brag.
Oh, here we go. Michael called me a young man there. I think he's up
the
to
entire Irish whiskey industries. Bloody tasting notes, from Dave to Jar, to Dave McCabe.
You had.
There was a tremendous amount of, how would you put it, cop-on mixed with genuine affection, mixed with genuine curiosity. There was a lot of love toward the history side that manifested itself. So I'm just fresh off the train from bloody Dublin, because we had the cleanup crew from the night before, where Jack and Brian and Mick were all lending a hand. There is that space, there is that understanding in Irish whiskey that there was this deep wellspring of mash bill history. And of course, like the thesis proper, is about, as Dave will remember, it's quite clinical. You're given stuff at a certain strength, and you're told rank 0 to 3, from not present to extremely present, and you try and take objective traits and make them subjective traits and make them as objective as possible.
Yeah.
There was that, again, that breathing room. What do we do with this? All this data. What do we do when we have, all these master blenders and young Turks and all this stuff in one place? And and all we can do is give it back to you guys and see what you do with it. Full stop. And that's what these spirits have been about in a less formal capacity, is play with the past, take the past, but don't inertly replicate it. Kind of do what you want with it. You're the present. Take the past and rejigger it into a way that draws.
I think David really exemplifies taking that history and creating something really exciting, really innovative, and going forward with it. And to be honest, how can you not be super excited about, coming back in 3 or 4 years and seeing what's going to be out there, when you have examples like this of people willing to take the risk and actually, delve into the history, take it forward, adopt it like you have, David, adopting, for example, the Connswater, making it relevant to today, and doing it in an elegant and non-bashful manner as well, if you don't mind me saying so.
I'll put it this way. Look, a lot of Irish producers historically, in the latter half of the 20th century, when they were compelled to make grain whiskey, made grain whiskey using pot still or malt mash bills, or even Bushmans weren't using a malt mash bill, but they were using a barley mash bill. And what we had as not sip number 2, but sample number 2, or sample number 1, was a backwards version of that, where you take a grain whiskey mash bill from the past and say, well, what would happen if you had to do a pot still? So that's where the generic Irish whiskey category could shine. Number 2 is a love letter back to the history of column distilled grain whiskey in Ireland, and what you could do with that treated literally. And then you look back at these, and I'll put it this way, the second one was preferable to the first. I was
you'd never thought you'd have heard that, in a million years, coming out of Fionnán's mouth to say that grain was
fine. And I know when I'm usually on this bloody show, it's to wax lyrical about, barley and maybe oats and blah, 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 high congener retention, tailsy cuts and blah, blah, blah. But yeah, that first one was, or that. Sorry,
I think
second
the journey got to you, Fionnán, that train trip up.
Yeah. It's amazing. You go through a change of weather just as you're crossing Dundalk, and you're, your taste buds the same
those
way.
extra few degrees. Look, I know. When people start congratulating and say "great show," I'm starting to feel that they're getting tired and they want to wind down. I could be here all night, but I'm happy to keep going. I'm more than happy to keep going. But
and of course, I didn't mean to edit you out. You know, when we talked about the formal tasting. For anyone who doesn't know, Sergey is fucking bankrolled the glassware. So now it's 650. Thanks be COVID and having like use single-use glassware. Sergey's been stuck with 650 fucking capitas. So
we'll be a few computers away over the next while. So I have to actually thank Urban Bar as well for providing those. And I think they delivered on time and the quantity we want. So big hats off to them as well, in fairness. Yeah. And Fionnán, thank you for washing the label off them.
Oh yeah,
yeah. But look, I've been up to your estate. You are the featured distillery in our next issue. Mm-hmm. So we have some beautiful photography. We have some lovely interviews and some background about the distillery. There's a distillery and there's the estate, you know, and you could do far worse than going for either reason, you know, and both together, it's a perfect blend. Yeah. You know, but a great house, and I think people, you know, if you get a chance to be passing by or anywhere near it, it's a definite stop in to have a look around, and I'm sure you'll make them welcome and give them gin or whiskey. And chocolates.
Yeah, certainly gin, chocolates, and hopefully in the near future some whiskey as well.
Yeah. Well, look, if there's anything you want to, and David, you want anything else you want to close on?
I think just congrats, Serge, on 50 episodes. I've enjoyed them all.
Well, thank you. Yes, you have listened to a few of them.
And I look forward to being able to welcome everyone back to the distillery again. You know, it's been a strange 18 months for everyone, but we we are open again, and we look forward to seeing people. And thank you everyone for the support. And I hope everyone's enjoyed that. And I'm going to be rude, but I'm going to enjoy the last of my single pot still sample from Saturday or from Sunday. So Sláinte.
Yeah, geez, I all your sorry worried about the bloody pots and pieces that you were in. I haven't enjoyed any of my bloody Rademon Belfast Whiskey Week samples. So when we're off camera, I'm going to be drinking this stuff with you.
So you know, I recommend going to sample 5.
Yeah, look, to all our listeners, thank you all for joining. I can't thank you enough for the support we've got over the last 50 episodes. You know, when we started it up, it was a kind of a distraction to try and forget about all the misery around COVID, and also kind of, the truth be told, to fill in the gap while we found it difficult to get the next issues out. And you've all been very supportive, and our guests have been fantastic. I can't thank our guests enough. To be able to speak to the people that are influencing and putting their stamp on Irish whiskey, whether it's producers, tourism, the designers, you know, the people that write about the history. It's a dream come true for me to be able to speak to these people, and to share it makes it even more special. And I've been blessed to have made some fantastic friends while being able to do this, and you know, I'm grateful for them and grateful to be able to do this. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing in the celebration. We hope that we continue for another 50, and we won't take anything for granted, but thank you, and look forward to catching you next week and discussing something interesting as well. So look after yourselves. If you have enjoyed it, please do try and support the YouTube channel by subscribing to that. And if you really like it and you want to find out more about Fionnán's work, 7 Sips in the next issue, which I know he's working on now.
Oh, jeez.
And find out more about Rademon Estate in the next issue, please do subscribe. So take care of yourselves. Thank you all very much. And congratulations to Belfast Whiskey Week. You know, in this climate, to be able to pull off this stature of an event is beyond commendable. It's unbelievable. So well done. And I know that we're only kind of halfway through Belfast Whiskey Week, so I may pop up on Saturday myself to Belfast and end up where you are, Fionnán, somewhere there. So well done to Paul and all the team, and for the team that helped us share it on their platform. So enough waffle. Speak to you next week. Sláinte, everybody, and best of luck in the future. Sláinte.
Cheers. Sláinte.